Hi everyone, and welcome to Support U's new podcast series. I'm Jamie, one of Support U's support officers and today's presenter. Support U have recently secured funding from the Police and Crime Commissioners, and as a result of this, we are taking a stand against domestic abuse and violence, and supporting the LGBT plus community where statistics are staggering. Today we are thrilled to share that we are collaborating with the national leading LGBT plus domestic abuse support service, Gallup. Joining us today is Matthew, a caseworker who has worked and continues to work with the many victims of domestic abuse in our community, the LGBT plus community. Today's interview will be focusing on domestic abuse within the community, why statistics are so high, and the impact of COVID-19. As well as these important topics, we will be covering what support Gallup and Support U offer. We would like to thank Gallup for collaborating with us. Equally, a huge thank you to Matthew for all the hard work that he does and continues to do in supporting the many victims and survivors of domestic abuse and violence. You can follow Gallup on all social media platforms to follow their campaign, Beyond Recognition. Equally, you can follow Support U on all social media platforms to support our campaign. Support U stands with you. So, to go straight in today, Matthew, I'm going to ask the question, what is the difference between domestic violence and domestic abuse? And furthermore, what are the other forms of abuse and how might these present themselves?
Absolutely. So when we think of domestic violence, we specifically think of physical violence. But when we think of domestic abuse, we think of all the different types of abuse that can happen either in an intimate partnership or from a close friend or family member. And that can include emotional abuse, which can be very cruel, putting someone down all the time, you're fat, you're old, you're ugly, no one else wants you. You better stay with me because you'll never get any support or love anywhere else. Financial abuse, so the abuser takes control of all the finances, so the person being abused has no independence of control of their own. Some victim survivors are forced to give up their jobs, so they're completely dependent on the person that's abusing them. Coercive and controlling behaviour. So that's behaviour from an abuser that sets out to harm, punish or frighten their victim into staying with them and controlling them every moment of the day. The abusive person stopping them from seeing their family or friends or wider support networks, because if a victim survivor has a good support network around them, it's easier for them to leave the abusive person, where if those relationships are broken down, it can leave the victim survivor feeling stuck and they've got no choice but to stay in that situation. Another thing I just want to mention is social media. That comes up a lot. I mean, social media is brilliant. It has all these advantages, but for people experiencing domestic abuse, it can be a nightmare because the abusive person can threaten to put not just information about their sexuality or gender identity that they might not be comfortable in everyone seeing, but really personal information. And it can be a case of, you leave me, I'm going to post all this private information out there about you. But anyone listening to this, I just want to assure you, if you're in that situation, there is help. There are things that can be done to stop this from happening. And we'll talk about that later on.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, I think it's so great that you've commented on social media because I think it is that, positive and negative. It's very contrasting. And, we have seen an increase in revenge porn over the last few years as well, which is something that can definitely come into sexuality in terms of the abuse and blackmail as well, which is quite a worrying thought. But as you say, there is support out there that can definitely be arranged for anyone that's listening and can recognise any of these themes. And also, so Gallup released a report disclosing that verbal and emotional abuse is the most common for LGBT individuals. However, the report also educated us to understand that 85% of the survivors are victims to more than one type of abuse. For example, whilst they might be verbally and emotionally abused, they may also be being physically abused. As a caseworker that sees and hears these cases day in and day out, what is the most common form of abuse that you have come across? And do cases typically have more than one type of abuse taking place?
I think in answer to the first part of that question, there isn't one specific type of abuse that I think I see more than anything else. But what I would say is if a victim survivor comes to me and they're disclosing one type of abuse, as soon as you start digging a bit deeper, there's definitely multiple types of abuse going on. And again, when we sort of focus on physical violence, someone may say that actually I'm not experiencing abuse anymore because my partner hasn't been violent towards me for over 6 months now. But when you look at I think, well, what's happening here? Is the abusive person just stopped being abusive? But if you dig a bit deeper, what you'll find is that perhaps the victim survivor is doing exactly what the abusive person wants them to do. Then they're not mixing with their own friends and family members. They're only leaving the house when they've been given permission to do so. In terms of sexual relations, they're having sex when the abusive person wants sex, and the victim survivor is not making any consent or decisions of their own. Financial abuse, that's another way of controlling someone. So in actual fact, the victim survivor can think, okay, well, the abuse has gone away, but actually the abuse is constant and it's there all the time in multiple different ways.
Absolutely. And something that I've seen with service users, specifically focusing on the abuse aspect of things, especially with the younger LGBT community, psychological abuse is a common trend. But I completely agree with what you're saying. You know, every case is completely unique, and you see all of those different types of abuse on a regular basis, unfortunately.
Yeah.
And it's very common to come across more than one type in their lives,
Yeah.
unfortunately, because these types of abuse seem to lead into each other, and they might start as psychological and then slowly get bigger and bigger and bigger. But you know, it's so key to remember as well, whatever type of abuse is taking place, they are all equally as harmful as one another.
Yeah. Agreed.
Mm,
Yeah.
yeah. So in terms of who can be affected by domestic abuse, could you share some information on that? So who is vulnerable to domestic abuse and violence?
Anyone can experiencing domestic abuse or violence. And I think something that we hear quite a lot is that I would never allow myself to be in that situation. And what we have to remember is if you look at intimate partnerships, the abusive person is not abusive to begin with. They're clever. They know how to woo their victim survivors. And quite often people will say, when I first met my partner, you know, they were absolutely amazing. They were so kind, so loving, so caring. I really thought this is too good to be true. And in some ways that was the case. And then, like you say, the patterns that you talked about earlier happen. They start perhaps saying to their partner, well, you know, I don't feel comfortable when you meet with that friend of yours. You know, I'd rather that you didn't see them anymore. And why do you have to spend every Sunday with your family? Don't you love me? Aren't I important to you? And then it perhaps starts escalating into things that are more sinister, more controlling, and then it can escalate into severe acts of abuse, of violence, and threats, and sexual violence. And then all of a sudden this person is left thinking, how on earth did I get into this situation? What's happening here? And they're trying to make sense of it all.
Mm,
So yeah, I mean, of course, it's, as I, you know, it's not just women and girls, it's people of all sexualities, genders, identities, faith, religion, culture. you know, each and every one of us could potentially be affected by domestic abuse, unfortunately.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, I've heard it many times, as you say, I will never be a victim of domestic abuse. And I think it's key to remember that it really can come from anywhere. And as you say, the perpetrators are very clever. They know what they're doing. And it's very sinister. And just to reiterate, domestic abuse really can affect anybody, regardless of race, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, age, neurodiversity, physical and mental health, ability and disability, and so on. That said, evidence highlights that those who identify as a part of a minority group, such as being LGBT+, are indicated to be more at risk of being a victim. And a huge misconception regarding domestic abuse is that it only takes place in intimate relationships. Are there any other circumstances or situations where domestic abuse can take place?
Yeah, so certainly when we think of the legal definition of domestic abuse, it's intimate partners, but it's also close family members. So it's usually siblings, parents, people within our immediate family circles. But when you kind of start to move into what is called so-called honour-based violence, it can include wider members of the community and family as well. And LGBT people often experience honour-based violence on the basis of their sexuality or gender identity. And it may start with the fact that somebody's parents will discover that their child is LGBT, and the abuse will start there. But then once the wider community gets to know about this, it can really escalate, and it can come from all different directions. And it's, you know, honour-based violence, it's not just around targeted at LGBT people. It can just be people walking down the street, smoking a cigarette or drinking alcohol, the way people dress, choices they make in terms of marriage and relationships, anything that is seen to be causing dishonour to someone's culture or faith. People think that is a reason to perpetrate abuse onto an individual.
Absolutely. And I think as soon as you appear to be different, in society, you're instantly vulnerable. And the thing that I always try to get out there is we are all different. Everyone in this planet is different. And, you know, we should embrace that. And it very much leads on to Support U's slogan, which is diversity matters. Because it really does. Diversity is what makes the world go round. And it's such a shame to think that these differences can be a motivation behind abuse.
Yeah.
It really is. And in terms of situational factors, it can appear in the workplace, in social groups within the family, and even care homes. Therefore, domestic abuse and violence does not only appear within intimate relationships, suggesting that this might be another reason why those who identify in a minority group will be at more risk of different variations of abuse and violence. And leading on from this, in terms of the LGBT plus community, members are disproportionately affected by domestic abuse and violence in comparison to those who are cisgendered and heterosexual. Why is this?
Well, a term that we often use in the domestic violence world is people from multiple disadvantages. And one disadvantaged group would be LGBT. And whilst that may sound quite disempowering for people that are listening to that, there's many wonderful things about being LGBT, but we know as LGBT people, we experience a lot more challenges. So someone may have to keep their intimate partnership very hidden, because if they're experiencing abuse from an intimate partner, they can't just go to their friends and family, because then they're essentially outing themselves, and the risk of abuse will massively increase. We have situations where perhaps people know abuse is going on in their intimate partnership, but they've had so many negative things said about their sexuality or being in an LGBT relationship, they feel like they're dishonouring their own community. And as an LGBT community, we are very united. You know, we fight off homophobia, transphobia and biphobia. And this is where I found it very concerning when I started coming into this line of work. The abuse is often coming from members of our own community.
Absolutely.
And we also know that people with LGBT people are more likely to experience mental health problems, and that could be related to, you know, negative things that they've had said to them about their sexuality or gender identity. People that are LGBT are more likely to experience or have substance misuse problems. So all these different complications, you know, they lead on to people becoming more vulnerable.
Absolutely. And, you know, I think the key thing as well to remember is in terms of homophobia, biphobia, and transphobia, those who identify as LGBT plus may also have internalized homophobia, transphobia, or biphobia. And this can be triggered by the abuse that's going on, especially abuse within the family home. You know, if a young person is being shown that same-sex marriage is not equal and it's not something that is a family value within their home, that's going to trigger those destructive feelings for that individual. So whilst they're going to have that psychological abuse going on, they're also going to have difficulties with their self-esteem, which is when we're then going to come onto the territory of, you know, self-harming, and even, you know, alarming worries of suicide as well. So it's really important, I think, to look at the bigger picture, isn't it? It's we need to think about the impact of the abuse on the individual. It might not just be that they have, you know, physical injuries and a poorer mental health, but it actually might encourage them to make those more impulsive decisions, which can be very harmful at times. But yeah, so it's important that we are all responsible for understanding warning signs and risk factors, and you can learn about these by visiting Support U's social media pages or reaching out via our website. If you believe that somebody you know is being abused, please know that you can also call Gallup on their helpline, as this is equally for allies and supporters as well as the survivors. Focusing on the minority group of sexuality and gender identity, Gallup's service users between 2013 and 2017 show us that 55% of survivors identified as gay, 20% were lesbian, 9% were bisexual, and 14% were transgender. In terms of 55% of Gallup's service users being gay, is there any evidence or understandings that suggest why gay individuals were most likely to be victims of abuse and violence?
I think it's more in terms of who is coming through the door. And I think, you know, the sector itself is called Violence Against Women and Girls, the VORG sector. And it's very odd when I'm in a professionals meeting and, you know, everyone will sort of introduce themselves, and then you've got someone will pop up and say, yes, I'm the strategic lead of Violence Against Women and Girls. And we're sat there talking about a male client. So there are so many fantastic services for women and girls, specifically to help victim survivors of domestic abuse. There aren't as many for men. And there are specialist services for men, but perhaps gay men would, and certainly gay or bisexual men would feel more comfortable coming to an LGBT service. The other thing I would say, though, is we do know some trans women as well, but particularly gay and bisexual men at the moment are using chems, so crystal meth, methadone, and GHB. And we, you know, I would say on average, perhaps 25 to 50% of my service users, there is chems in the relationship. Either the victim survivor themselves is using chems, the person perpetrating the abuse, or both parties or various parties within that are using chems. So that may be another contributing factor, and we certainly know it massively increases the risk to people. But also perhaps these, you know, whilst we want to highlight the dangers, we also want to make sure that our services are fully accessible for our community. And if a victim survivor comes forward, discloses abuse, but they also disclose that they're using chems, we don't want to sort of make judgment on people's personal choices. Our priority is to help keep that individual safe.
Yeah.
And I think people feel more comfortable coming to an LGBT service because certainly all of us at Gallup have a lot of understanding around this issue,
Mhm.
where certainly when I talk to other domestic violence services, a lot of them have never heard of this, CHEMS.
Mm. Yeah, and chemsex, if there's anybody listening who isn't too sure what chemsex is, would you mind just giving a bit of an explanation as to what that
Yeah,
is?
of course. So there's three types of drugs that are mostly used. Crystal meth, which can either be smoked or injected. Um, Methadone is used frequently, which I believe is people can sniff that, and GHB as well, which is like a liquid drug. That, and all of these drugs are used to heighten sexual pleasure.
Mm.
And for many gay and bisexual men and trans women as well, or trans people or other people within the LGBT community potentially use these drugs whilst they're having sex because it heightens pleasure.
Mm.
But for some people, it can bring on, particularly crystal meth, feelings of paranoia, and it can sort of result in people acting quite violently. They actually feel their life is at risk, so they may actually carry out an extreme act of violence, either to themselves or another person, because they themselves feel that they're in danger. And also that, perhaps if people are under the influence of using these drugs, they're not in control.
Mm.
And sadly, people will put GHB into people's drinks and drug them and rape them.
Mm.
It's very serious and it's very worrying.
Absolutely. I mean, chemsex is a whole other podcast, really,
Yeah,
isn't it? And I totally agree. It really does come into all aspects of supporting the LGBT community, not just domestic abuse and violence, but it is something that often crops up, especially with online dating as well. There's a massive increase there, which I think a lot of people have noticed.
mm,
And just going back to the question as well. So it's worth noting that 55% of Gallup survivors between 2013 and 2017 were disabled as well as LGBT plus. Furthermore, 48% of the LGBT domestic abuse survivors were also of a minority ethnic group. This evidence solidates that those who are part of a minority group are at more risk due to being what is deemed as differently by society, and perhaps having more than one of these differences can put you more at risk of being in that category of being a survivor or victim of domestic abuse and violence. We understand that LGBT individuals are more vulnerable to domestic abuse because they are part of a minority group. For example, family members might abuse their children due to not accepting their sexuality and/or gender identity. This can happen for a range of reasons, such as religious beliefs, personal experiences, and family values. 23% of Gallup survivors shared that their abusers were either one or more family members, meaning their abuse was taking place within the family unit. I mean, this is a highly devastating statistic. And as well as this, 74% of survivors shared that their abuse took place in or around their home. How can we spot the signs if it takes place behind closed doors? Is there anything that we can do as allies and supporters to encourage communication with our loved ones?
I think if we do you mean within a kind of a family context or
Yeah, I mean, so with it's very easy to assume that our friends and families and loved ones are living in a loving family home with supportive families, when in reality, they might be struggling and there might be a lot of abuse going on
yeah.
in relation to their sexuality. So if we're not being told this by our friend or family member, how can we look for those signs or perhaps encourage that communication so that we can support them?
I think in terms of that suspected abuse coming from family members, I think if we see an individual from within the LGBT community that is is normally when they're with friends or when they're people they can be completely comfortable with, is very outgoing and very confident. But then we may see them with their family members, they're very withdrawn, they're very anxious about family finding things out about them. And I think if we suspect something is going on, my advice would be it's better to talk about it than not talk about it.
Mm.
So you could gently bring up with someone, look, I just, please tell me if it's none of my business, but I noticed that when you're with, our circle of friends, you're really comfortable with who you are, but when you're around your family, you almost hide your identity, and you seem very anxious and frightened sometimes. If they completely shut down, I don't think, we don't want to force the issue. We don't want to sort of push them away. But I would say it's good to say, if we suspect someone is experiencing abuse, we should say to them, I just want you to know that I am a friend, I am someone that can be trusted. And if ever you experience any kind of problems, please know that I'm here to help you. Come and stay with me if you need somewhere safe to stay, or just come and talk to me and I will do whatever I can to help.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, as you say, if they close up and you can sort of sense that they are not prepared to talk about this issue, it's really important that we respect that at that point. I think it's very easy for us to then think, something's definitely going on, we've got to find out, we've got to do this, we've got to keep asking because we need answers, when in reality, in this individual's life, they're going to have a lot of pressure going on already. So the riskful thing would be to add more pressure onto that individual. And another thing that I often do with some people that I work with, if they struggle to communicate verbally, they might have something that they want to tell me, but they feel they can't tell me face to face. I will encourage them to write it in an email or write it down on a piece of paper, because sometimes actually saying those things out loud makes it feel much more real. So I think it's key to remember that communication doesn't always have to be verbal. And there are other ways around it. But I think, yeah, definitely always appreciate when somebody doesn't want to communicate, because we really don't want to push them further, because that can have an even more detrimental impact, really. And the National LGBT Youth Homeless Charity, AKT, the Albert Kennedy Trust, supports young people from the age of 16 up to 25 who are homeless and lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and so on. AKT have informed that 24%, just under 1/4, of the UK homeless population is children and young people that identify as LGBT+. A staggering 77% of those young people believe that they were made homeless by their parents and families as a result of coming out and identifying as LGBT. This suggests that there were also forms of abuse taking place, perhaps emotional or psychological. Being a caseworker for the incredible Gallup team, have you come across cases of young people being abused by their parents and families as a result of their identity?
Absolutely. I mean, I've got two very fantastic colleagues who are young people's workers. So most of our 25 and under clients are usually, I get the pleasure occasionally to work with young people, but usually those cases sit with the experts. And I think, with young people, it's especially important, we have to help people with the practical side of things, making sure they've got safe accommodation, they've got enough income, that, we support them to get injunctions if necessary, and to report incidences to the police if they're happy to do so. But, these are people often that are just starting out of life and they're discovering their independence. We want to sort of help them to avoid a situation where they experience further exploitation. So the emotional support is really important, that we access, we get them linked into a counselling service, we get them linked into LGBT support groups where they can meet other allies and build up their support networks. Maybe sexual health support services if they disclose they're using chems, organisations where, they're not necessarily going to say to people you have to stop this, but certainly give them support and advice to help them keep safe.
Yeah, absolutely. And with those younger people as well, we see the incredible difference that early intervention has as well.
Mm.
So as soon as we get those stories and those cases come to us, it's so important for us to act immediately to really impact the future, to give the young people the best possible chance at later life. And yeah, just to throw in as well, Support You offer a weekly youth group, which is currently online due to the lovely corona. Um, but the support group is amazing, and it's so essential that children have this place to come to and feel accepted and embraced and noticed. I think it's that feeling of wanting to be noticed, because at home they can quite often be ignored because of their identity, which is absolutely heartbreaking. Um, and if there is a young person listening today who recognises that they might be being abused by their parents and or family members, whether that's emotionally, physically, sexually, etc., what would you advise them to do?
So we run the National LGBT Domestic Abuse Helpline. Do contact us at Gallup. Other organisations out there do a fantastic job. Do reach out and get support. If you're anxious about making that first step on your own, maybe sort of ask a friend if they can help you with that, to make that initial phone call, to make that initial reach out. But I just want you to know that however bad things feel, you don't have to stay in this situation. There are organisations and other people out there that can get you out of this situation. And you know, we at Gallup believe that everyone has the right to live a life that is free from abuse. So
Uh,
please do reach out and get that help.
For sure. And if you want to reach out to Support You, which is an LGBT plus support service, you can contact us on 0118 321 9111. If you want to reach out to Gallup, the leading LGBT domestic abuse service, you can call on 0800 999 5428. You can also reach out to Childline, which is the Children's Helpline, on 0800 1111, and the Albert Kennedy Trust, which is the LGBT Homeless Youth Service, on 020 7831. And that brings us to the end of today's interview with Gallup. We would like to thank Gallup for collaborating with Support You on our campaign against domestic abuse and violence. Support You stands with you. Furthermore, a huge thank you to Matthew for making the time to chat with us today to help raise awareness. We are grateful to have this opportunity with you, and especially appreciate you for the essential work that you do and continue to do. If you are a victim of abuse and are seeking support, please contact Gallup on 0800 999 5428. Alternatively, if you are based in the Thames Valley, please contact Support You on 0118 321 9111. For more information on services available, whether that be for survivors, friends, family members, and so on, please visit Gallup at www.gallup.org.uk and Support You at www.supportyou.org.uk. In the instance of an emergency, please reach the emergency services on 999. If you are unable to talk, please dial 999 and then press 55. Thank you for tuning in today, and we hope that this has been informative. If you would like to learn further information, please do not hesitate to get in touch. And remember, Support You stands with you.